So final round, round five, I actually got kind of a lucky pairing here, being paired white against National Master Teddie Wen. At this point, there was three players with 3.5 out of 4 in the event. It was Grandmaster Timur Gareev, who was the top seed. I am John Daniel Bryant, who was the number 2 seed at this point, and then myself third. And so the way the pairings worked out was Gareev and Bryant were playing on board one, both with 3.5. And I was paired against Teddie Wen, who was one of the highest rated players with 3 points. There were some other players as well on three, like Seviano and Shlyatenko, but these were my previous opponents, so I couldn't play them again. And then I end up getting a second white game in a row. I wasn't exactly sure why this happened. I was due black, but presumably so was my opponent, and I'm guessing he had, 2 whites in a row earlier in the tournament or something, and so that's why they gave him his due color rather than me being the higher rated player. So I definitely wasn't complaining. I was expecting to possibly have black against Gareev in the final round, and that's not a game you usually score in. So to get white against like lower rated player definitely felt like a boost in morale, and I felt like, wow, I actually have a chance to win the tournament based on what happens on board one. Now Teddy's a player I played last year in one of the events in Las Vegas. And we actually had a very fighting game in the King's Indian. And so pretty much all my prep for this game, we had I think 10 minutes or so with the pairings, was to just review the previous game, review my notes to that game, and also review the video that I made of that game so that I could see exactly what I said, because I figured my opponent might watch the video to see, what I said about the opening, and then that might help him with his preparation. So I wanted to really make sure I wasn't walking into something. Because in that game and in this game, I end up playing this h3 bishop e3 line, which, okay, I've been playing for a few years now, and generally really enjoy the positions that I get. And yeah, we actually follow our previous game for some time: e5, d5, a5, g4, knight a6, knight g2, and knight d7. And so in our first game, originally in this position, I played queen to d2. I mean, the whole point of this line is white is trying to build up a kingside attack with knight g3, bishop h6, h4, h5, bishop e2, and so on. But there are different move orders that white can do it in, and different options that black is allowed. So the move orders here are definitely, I think, quite complicated. So in our last game, I went queen d2, knight c5, knight g3, c6, f3, and then takes. Black played bishop f6, which I thought was a very interesting idea, stopping white from playing h4 and provoking me to going g5 and h4 like this, where after f5, black had very, very good counterplay. So that was a really complicated game. I was actually pretty much busted out of the opening. Then I went on to win because I kind of turned things around. But yeah, in this game, I tried to improve on things with this move h4, which I felt like was a better way to start this position. Now whenever black goes bishop f6, then okay, g5, h5, white is kind of a little bit faster compared to those other lines. So I felt like this was a small improvement. Of course, the position is still very playable for black. He goes knight c5, knight g3, c6, f3. We kind of continue along normal lines. Takes. And here black plays bishop f6 once again, which I kind of knew isn't supposed to be as good here, but I wasn't exactly sure why. Just I figured that the position is a better version for white. So I spent a little bit of time here, but of course I ended up going g5, bishop g7, and h5. I mean, this is the usual recipe. You just want to push this pawn very, very quickly, and the idea is you might play h6 and totally shut down the bishop, or we might go hg, of course, at some point, and actually, in fact, this one is more likely, and play for this attack on the h-file. This is kind of white's idea in this position. So f5. Of course, black has to play this move to try and create counterplay, and now white has some very, very typical options here. So the main option usually for white in these positions is to take on g6. And okay, then if black recaptures, then white goes e takes f5, and essentially black's kingside is opening up here quite a bit. And so usually this position, I would imagine, is quite nice for white. We can play knight h5 here, we can play queen d2. On f4, there's always stuff like bishop takes c5, followed by knight to e4, and so the pawn stays alive, and yeah, white keeps kind of a nice grip on the light squares, and then eventually the plan is to castle queenside, bring a rook to g1, bishop to d3, and so on. And yeah, the bishop on g7 can really suffer quite a bit in these positions when white has this kind of full blockade in the center. So this I felt like should be good for white. And if bishop takes f5, it doesn't really change much. White just takes, let's say, gf5. White can even like take on a6 here, go queen d2, castles, and yeah, essentially it's kind of like a dragon, but white's king is going to be very, very safe on b1. It's going to be hard for black to get to it, whereas black's king is going to be open here for the rest of the game. So HG in return really wasn't a problem. What I didn't like was that black can go f4. And I tried to figure out this line because sometimes black does this where they give up 2 pawns, with check, king h8. But then they argue that like the king is actually very safe on h8 and it's hard to get to with this h7 pawn being on the board. And then because of the fork, I'd be forced to play bishop takes c5, let's say knight takes c5, and I was thinking something like knight h5, queen takes g5. And yeah, from afar, like visualizing this position, I had a really hard time evaluating it because I really wasn't sure. Like I'm up 1 pawn, but okay, that doesn't really matter. I gave up the dark squared bishop, and yeah, who knows? I thought black might get some play. The knight on h5 I thought is weird. Like I don't really want to take on g7, but maybe somewhere black goes bishop h6 and the knight feels a little bit loose. And so yeah, ultimately I just couldn't evaluate this position, and I ended up deciding against it. The engine says white is just like totally winning here, just like queen d2, castle queenside, just get the bishop out. Once the rook comes to g1, white is just breaking through, which is very, very simple. And like once you see it, it starts to make a lot of sense. But yeah, during the game, like just things felt very, very fuzzy here. That's all I can really say. But yeah, I just wanted to point out that, okay, it's a position I greatly misevaluated and turns out to be nice for white. And that was, I think, objectively best, but given that I really wasn't sure about all these lines, I ended up going g takes f6 en passant, because of course black just played f5, so g f6. And this is definitely a good option after queen takes f6, bishop e2. I think white is better here because I'm getting play on the king side. Black doesn't really have a ton of counterplay as long as I can just keep everything defended here. And yeah, there's a number of plans for white to keep improving the position from here. So I was still feeling pretty good around this moment. Here black goes bishop d7, queen d2, b5. Definitely very logical play, just trying to get b4. The problem is this doesn't always achieve a whole lot because the knight just moves back, and yeah, black doesn't really have a ton of ways of entering white's position. Here I throw in hg because I figured no reason not to make this move just right now. I don't think h6 is really so great for white unless the bishop is just buried forever. Here it's not. Eventually it can of course come out via f6, or if we're getting something immediate, I figure it's much more likely that I'm just going to want to play queen h2 at some point and try to play for mate. So I decide to just open the file. I can also play bishop h6 somewhere if I want to force the trade of the bishops, although strategically that's not really what white would like to do. Strategically, our bishop on e3 is better. It's just that if white is playing for checkmate, then okay, bishop h6 is a very important idea to keep in mind. And here I end up playing knight d1, which I really like during the game, and I think is one of the best moves in the position. The idea, of course, is that I'm anticipating black pushing b4 and just getting my knight over to f2, and then the knight I figured is quite well placed here. It was also possible to play like rook c1, waiting for b4, and then going knight d1. This might have been a little bit better. And actually another very interesting option is to just castle, which I thought about during the game. To me it looked very, very scary. But the point is that if black plays, let's say, rook fc8, white's in time with king b1, and then if b4, there's knight b5. And although it looks risky, black concretely doesn't really have a way to trap this knight, or to take advantage. If rook b8, there's like knight a7, for example, and stuff like this. Or if black goes b4 first, then just knight b5, and again, rook fc8, king b1. And yeah, concretely, black doesn't have a way to exploit this knight on e5. I think if rook cb8, then there's like bishop g5 possibly. Though I'm not really sure. I didn't check these lines in huge detail, but I thought this was kind of an interesting point. During the game, it crossed my mind, but it really just felt way too risky. I just thought it's interesting that white is actually able to get away with this one. I do like knight d1 more. I think this ends up just being a more natural move. Again, rook c1 maybe first also makes sense. Here black goes rook a c8. And yeah, now I kind of changed my mind a little bit. I felt like, okay, after knight f2, white is clearly better. And there's a couple different plans I can play here. Like I can put my king on g2, bring the other rook to g1, put my king back on f1, and then look for ideas like knight h5, bishop h6, just playing for the king side. White can also castle here and then go like king g2, rook h1 with kind of the same plan. But yeah, I feel like it's better for white, but I end up going bishop g5, forcing queen f7 and knight e3. Because during the game, somehow I just felt like this is a little bit more active. And with the knight on e3, I'm not just fighting for the g4 square, but I'm also maybe looking for some knight f5 ideas. And then I want to go like king f2 and rook ag1. And this looked very promising to me because I felt like white might get some real attacking chances. I was mainly concerned with like bishop f6, like trying to trade off these bishops before white is ready. But then I realized I can go bishop h6 here, bishop g7, and then like king f2. And I realized that this is actually starting to look very nice for white. If black takes, the rook comes in, second rook comes to h1. Otherwise, I want to take on g7 and then look for some knight f5 ideas, especially with the rook on g1, knight f5, everything opening up on the g file, knight gf5. And yeah, it just looked very scary for black. So I got very excited here, again, pretty optimistic about my chances. And black ends up going knight b4, which is kind of the only move, but a very logical move, just placing the knight actively, targeting some of these weak squares like c2 and d3, so some tactical opportunities here. And it's actually quite hard for white to deal with these knights on the queen side. Like if a3, of course, there's always knight b3. And even if I get my rook out of the way, apart from the a2 pawn hanging, a3 is still a very dangerous move for me to play because black will eventually get knight b3, knight d4, and then the knight on d4 is very strong. In fact, if you haven't seen my previous game against Teddie, he is able to get his knight to d4, and it's just like totally dominating. So it shows you the power of that one. So once we got here, I realized, oh, you know what, I've probably messed things up because intuitively my idea would be king to f2 here. But the problem is that here black can throw a knight in on d3 with check. So this is kind of the tactical issue. And if I take, there's queen takes f3, and taking this one with check, which looked terrible. Like, okay, my position is just like falling apart here, right? And then if I don't take this one, if I just move the king, then the knight gets to f4. And I didn't see what white is doing here because I really can't give up the dark square bishop. I mean, sometimes black will sacrifice a whole exchange on f4 just to get white to take and get e takes f4. Here, black is giving up a knight. So this is definitely would be a disaster for white. So yeah, I didn't realize that after knight b4, I'm not actually able to develop with king f2 and rook g1. I think I also considered castling here, but I felt like it's hurting my coordination. And so, yeah, it was actually really hard to just like even find a move for white. Because what to do? Knight d3 is kind of hanging over me, and yeah, it's having a hard time getting the rook over to the king side. So I ended up playing rook h2, and basically this was a kind of a waiting move, because they also didn't see exactly what black is going to do. Like black doesn't really have a lot of obvious moves. They can't really push a4, their knights can't really advance, bishop can't move. Rook can go to c7, but okay, it's not exactly, better there. It loses connection with the other rook. And I figured if he does play a move like rook to c7, my plan with rook h2 was actually to just kind of try to slowly improve here. So maybe I can put the rook on f2 and then start sliding the king over. Maybe I was thinking rook g2 somewhere. Yeah, just looking for play on the g file. But essentially just improving the rook, covering the f2 square. There are also some lines, I'm forgetting now, where this was kind of important, where otherwise like black would have like some knight takes e4 ideas and then queen f2 check, so I felt it was very useful to cover this one. And yeah, I really didn't see what black could do here other than bishop f6, which is what he ends up playing. This is just the only kind of productive move that black has in the position, at least just trying to do something, trading off the dark square bishops. Here I play bishop h6, bishop g7, and I decide to take. I thought about repeating as well. I didn't really think I'm like so much better at this point. I realized actually now things are very, very unclear. But I thought I still have chances to play for the initiative here. So I take on g7, queen takes g7, and rook g2. And now I have a very simple threat of knight gf5, queen f6, rook takes g6 check, queen takes, and knight e7. So which is actually kind of annoying for black to deal with, because for example, if black goes like rook f7 here, trying to cover the e7 square, well then knight f5 anyway. If queen f6, there's knight h6 check, and now, yeah, black just doesn't have a good move because d6 is also hanging. So if queen f8, then g6 falls. If queen f6, there's knight h6, and so black is losing. Of course, bishop takes f5, just knight takes, and doesn't really change anything. Black can sack the exchange, but I don't think it really helps a whole lot here. And then, okay, somewhere white will go king f2, get the second rook in, and it's just game over. So this looked quite scary because this knight f5, rook takes g6 is just kind of happening all over the place. But my opponent finds very strong move, queen h6. And I thought this was possible, like before we got here, but I really thought I would just have knight gf5 in this position, and that I would just kind of have to calculate it out to the end. Because here, of course, okay, black has queen h1 check, and queen takes rook on a1. So knight gf5 is a full rook sacrifice. And as I started calculating this one, I actually just like couldn't make it work. Like I was thinking knight f5, queen h1, king f2 takes, oh, excuse me. Check takes. I thought rook takes g6, king f7, and I thought like, okay, it's just a matter of time, but there has to be like forced mate here because I have so many pieces. I have rook g7, knight takes d6, rook f6 check, but I actually couldn't really find anything. Like rook g7, the king is running away, and you know, I'm down a rook, so this didn't feel clear at all. If knight takes d6, then king takes g6. I didn't see exactly how to mate here to, you know, get my queen somewhere in time. So I started considering rook f6 check, which I think from afar I thought this one was mating, because king takes, I get knight g4, and then the queen comes in. But actually, after king f7, there's no mate. You know, the queen doesn't come in with check. I can go knight takes d6, but then I lose some coordination. Then king g8, and there's just no mate here. I have a perpetual, of course, but no checkmate. So I spent a lot of time. This is move 27. I think my opponent is, again, approaching time trouble, like around probably like 15, 20 minutes or so. I had a little bit more than that. And yeah, I spent a lot of time, and I really just couldn't make it work. My second idea was to go king f2, followed by like rook h1, which I also thought was quite promising at first glance. But then I realized, you know, black can go queen f4, threatening stuff like knight takes e4, and on rook h1. So okay, here knight e4 I think would be quite risky in view of white's pieces kind of looming here. But even like a move like king f7, I thought is not so easy to meet, where like my knights are very restricted. Black wants to go rook h8 and challenge for the h file. The queen on f4 is really strong. Like I wasn't even sure why white should be better here. I think the engine does like white here. It gives like rook h7 check and then some concrete lines. But overall, my evaluation I think was not too far off. In fact, in this position, instead of king f7, black can even play this move, queen takes e4, which I did not consider. But it's kind of a funny move. Takes, and black gets their material back. Knight takes e4. I think I figured out that this one wasn't working. I forget exactly why, but maybe like takes and rook h6 or something like this. But yeah, this one I felt like wasn't so great. But yeah, queen takes c4. This one is definitely hard to argue with. But ultimately, I realized king f2, I'm just not really in time, and black is doing well. And so I was really stuck because I'm trying to figure out what to do. Of course, I should also mention black has this threat in the position, queen takes e3. So if I don't do anything to deal with this one, black is just going to trade off all the pieces and is going to be absolutely fine. And if I don't give mate here, then strategically, white is not in such great shape. Eventually I realized that this move, knight ef5, also has some sense. In most of the lines I was calculating, I was always starting with knight gf5, because, okay, you open up the rook on the g file, it makes sense. Here, knight ef5 doesn't make sense for a second reason, and that I'm allowing black to trade queens with check. But once I realized, like, this move is actually possible, then I started to calculate, and I realized actually there's some serious poison here. Because after knight ef5, queen takes d2, king takes d2. Of course, the d6 pawn is hanging, knight e7 check is a big threat, so black has to do something. Bishop takes, knight takes f5, again, doesn't really change anything, except now g6 pawn is hanging, and again, the second rook can come in as well. So of course, black would have to take the knight on f5 with the pawn, knight takes f5. If king goes to the h file, then we get mate. And I think this is the exact detail I kind of like noticed, that like, oh wait, if I go knight f5, takes, the king can't go to the h file, king is forced to go to f7. Then I started calculating this for real. My first idea was to make this work, rook g7 check and rook a g1, playing for checkmate. Then I realized black just takes and is absolutely fine here, not getting mated. But then I realized I can also just play knight takes d6. Just taking this pawn with check, king e7 seems forced, taking the rook, and we would get this endgame, where white has a rook and two extra pawns for two minor pieces, which materially speaking, okay, is pretty close. White is a little bit ahead, but if I started looking further, and if we take a look at the position, white immediately gets rook g7 check, and actually white's pieces here are much stronger, and black has serious dynamic issues. So king d6, rook h1 for example, and now I'm threatening rook h6 check, I'm threatening to double on the 7th rank. This king doesn't have a lot of squares, so the immediate threat is to give check, forcing king c7, and then bishop takes b5 because of the pin on the 7th rank. And I actually realized black's position here is very, very difficult. Despite, okay, black has like two pieces and the knights look kind of active, but it turns out like the knights are really not doing enough in the position, and white's rooks are just absolutely killing. So once I realized this endgame is nice, I end up just playing knight ef5, because I was like, okay, like this is definitely the best option that I found by far. And my opponent spent quite a bit of time here, but he ends up taking. I don't think he wanted to do this one, but he simply just couldn't find another move. I think the engine gives either queen h3 here or queen f4 and says black is okay, but these are really hard moves to make. Of course, there's like knight e7 check, knight takes d6. You know, this is just like concrete engine analysis that's saying black is okay. All right, queen h3 makes sense, like attacking the rook, but from a human point of view, it's really hard to even consider a move like that, because there's all kinds of stuff. Queen g5, king f2. Yeah, obviously we're not engines that can just calculate this stuff out. So I'll tell you guys, queen h3 was not on my radar at all. Neither was queen f4. On knight f5, honestly, I thought queen takes d2 is kind of the only move here, and it turns out not, but okay. My opponent ends up playing this one because he also couldn't find another move. I end up going right down this line. King f7, takes. I played rook g7 check, and rook h1, we reach this position, and yeah, once we got here, I definitely started feeling really, really good about my chances. Because again, rook h6 followed by bishop takes b5 is a huge threat. Bishop takes b5 immediately is also a threat with the point bishop takes rook h6, and black is just in huge, huge trouble. And yeah, it's just really hard to find anything here for black. Like knight a4, for example, trying to come in with the rook, just not in time. White gives rook h6 check, and the king is forced to go on to the c file. And again, we have this one. This was already possible, of course, and then bishop takes b5. And yeah, d6 also, rook h7 is just black's position essentially just collapsing. I thought he might try king c5, just giving the bishop, but at least getting king d4 and like some activity. But of course, it's not really enough as long as white doesn't get mated here. I think I was thinking I would go like bishop d1, and yeah, okay. As long as white's not getting mated, we're up the exchange and a bunch of pawns, and this d pawn should decide the game. But I thought something like this might be black's best practical chance. Black ends up playing knight takes d5 here, which makes sense. I can kind of understand it, because otherwise white's initiative is just too strong. But it does give back a lot of material. Black is now just down a clean exchange, and I figured this position should be winning. Black doesn't have any special counterplay, and we have a bunch of pawns. And at this point, it was just about like keeping cool and just slowly improving my position. So king e3, setting up stuff like rook to d1 check. Black pushed b4. Here I played rook c1, threatening all kinds of stuff like rook takes d7, followed by taking on c8. So black goes bishop f5. And here I played bishop b5. I mean, there are many ways of playing the position. Essentially, I was just trying to improve my pieces and also just set like concrete problems. Here I'm now threatening rook d1, where the king can't escape to the c file, would be forced to go to e6, and then bishop c4 check and rook f7, and yeah, white's pieces start coordinating perfectly. Here black played rook to b8, hard to suggest another move, and yeah, essentially just kind of allowed this simple finish. Rook f7, king g6, rook g1, and here my opponent resigned because the bishop is just lost. Next move, and then white's up a rook. So yeah, that was the end. I was pretty happy with the game. You know, I realized I didn't play the middle game perfectly, but analyzing afterwards, I realized honestly I just made one bad decision here after knight d1 to play this move bishop to g5 and knight e3. This was just the wrong setup, and white loses a lot of the coordination. It's also not necessarily great for me to allow the trade of darks for bishops. So yeah, had I played knight f2 here, it would have been quite a nice position. But other than this one decision, I felt like my play overall was quite reasonable. And I was really happy to find this finally knight ef5, because the move just wasn't coming to me. But once I realized there was something to it, then yeah, it just posed some very, very serious problems for black, and more or less won the game. And yeah, then I was definitely very happy with how I converted this one, just not really giving black any real chances. So that was it. On board one, Timur Gureyev ended up winning his game against international master Bryant, and we ended up sharing first place with 4.5 out of 5 each. Yeah, so I was super happy with the result afterwards. Obviously, if you guys have been following the analysis, you know that the games haven't been perfect, especially in round 1. I was in big trouble. In the round 4 game, I was also losing, although at least during the game, I wasn't aware of this fact. This game, I felt more or less in control for most of the time, and I felt like my rounds 2 and 3 were actually very, very clean as well. So overall, I definitely didn't feel too bad about the tournament. I felt like I played well, and yeah, overall technique was pretty good. So yeah, ended up sharing first, gaining a couple of, I think like maybe 16 or 17 USCF rating points, maybe a handful of FIDE. And yeah, it was definitely very nice to win the second straight tournament. So coming up next for me, I actually have 2 norm events that I'll be playing, 2 round robin tournaments, a GM norm round robin events starting at the end of March. So the first one will be March 25, and then it'll be like a 5-day event, and then a week break, and then another tournament right after. So those are obviously going to be very, very tough. I've been trying to do some chess, analyzing some positions and some openings to get ready for that, but we'll see how it goes. Hopefully we can keep playing well. I think those events, the games will be streamed live, which means people will be able to just follow the games on the spot, and I'll probably do more video recaps after the event. Okay, I'll probably attach a PGN of the games somewhere to this post. We'll see. It should be pretty visible. But yeah, if you got this far, thanks for checking out the games. Hopefully you found them useful and instructive. And yeah, leave a comment if you enjoyed the analysis. I'd be happy to hear it. All right, guys, until next time, take care.